Well, howdy, y'all. Welcome to Once Upon a Time in Texas, episode number 106. I'm your host, Michael Mitchell. Nothing too terribly exciting to announce this week, other than just had a lot going on, lots of stuff happening in the spring. Of course, the kids are starting to do some star testing stuff, and they're getting a little stressed out about that, which I get. Wife is also having to do star testing, administer it, which is stressful. And so anyway, it's just a little stressful, but things are moving along for all the kids in Scouts. My girls are starting to get prepared to go to Philmont Scout Ranch this summer. My son's troop went and did a kind of a Philmont checkout hike, and he did not participate this last weekend, but it was wet, rainy, drizzly, cold. And everybody that went said, yeah, it pretty much sucked. And so I'm glad we didn't go. However, we got the thrill of being here at home when a pretty massive hailstorm plowed the majority of Wichita Falls. And we were no different than anybody else. All of our vehicles got beat up pretty well and have a few hail dings on each one of them. I've already contacted the insurance and gone ahead and turned in those claims. It's what you're supposed to do, I guess. And so, but I'm one of thousands, I guess, here in Wichita Falls that got hit. And so it's just kind of one of those, well, damn it things. And so now the wife and I are talking more about maybe we ought to build a carport here at our old house. So yeah, we're kind of looking into some options. So anyway, who doesn't love stories about outlaws in the Wild West? Guys like Billy the Kid and Black Jack Ketchum and all, others are all almost, idolized to a point. But what about some lesser known outlaws that were equally as bad or did bad things? And what about the lawmen that caught them? They weren't all, white horses and honor and stuff like that. Some of them were just generally about as bad as the outlaws. So before we jump into this number 106, I want to thank our sponsors as always, me and Victory Home Loans. I know there are tons of people moving to and in Texas and Oklahoma, and I know a lot of y'all do too. So if you know somebody that's moving and needs help buying a home, or they already have a home and need it refinanced, or they need a reverse mortgage, or looking to buy some land, do construction, kind of anything having to do with homes and purchases, have them look me up. Send them my way. TheMichaelMitchell.com, TheMichaelMitchell.com. I think we are up to being able to shop 39 different lenders. And so that's a great thing. I love helping customers get in homes, and I love getting them the best deal that they can. So remember, when you work with me in Victory Home Loans, we sell dreams, not mortgages. So where'd this week's idea come from? Well, as usual, I saw something on the Traces of Texas Facebook group and started doing some other little digging. It led me down lots of little rabbit holes, and lots of other interesting things, including a guy that was part of a gang called the Outlaws, which I'd never heard before, which was later the Bill Doolin gang, kind of all over Oklahoma and Arkansas. Now, this doesn't have to do with Texas, but hang with me. I got cracked up on this one because the guy's name was Richard West, but his nickname was Little Dick. Now, I know that Dick is short for Richard, but seriously, could he not have demanded maybe another nickname? I mean, Little Dick? I'm sure he could not have been happy about that, but yet here he is in history, 140, 150 years later, and it's Richard Little Dick West. Yeah. All of their misdeeds, of course, in this group were in Oklahoma and Arkansas. And so I'm not talking about them, But I just thought I'd mention it because it was funny. It was a funny little side note. Anyway, I did some digging on Wikipedia, TSHA Online, and legendsofamerica.com and came up with a bit of history for y'all. So I really wanted to dig into some of the outlaws whose names are mentioned in a particular lawman story that we're going to talk about later. But there's really not a lot of record of them. So other than running into this particular lawman that we'll discuss. So these guys are A.J. Williams and Martin Morose. I figured there was something out there about them, but I honestly couldn't find hardly anything about them and just assumed that the majority of their lives and history have been, lost to history. And so I'll just talk about them in relation to our lawman. But I ended up looking up some other lawmen's names, and these guys weren't necessarily in Texas, but the lawman was. And so I'm going to talk about a few of these other outlaws, most of them in Arizona. So I'm going to talk about a few of them just to kind of give you an idea of who this lawman was going after, because I think that's important. So our first character I'll mention is this that this lawman chased was William Walters, also known as Bronco Bill. Other than Little Dick, I love their nicknames. So William E. Bronco Bill Walters was an outlaw during the closing days of the Old West. He is best known for the legend of his lost treasure, allegedly located in the area of Solomonville, Arizona. Bill Walters was born in Fort Sill in Oklahoma Territory, which is just right up the road from me, about 30 miles, so he was close to Texas. He worked most of his youth as a cowboy, probably in Texas too, then began working for the Santa Fe Railroad as a section hand. Shortly after becoming employed by the railroad, Walters became involved in train robberies and the robberies of stagecoaches. He began riding with the Jack Ketchum gang around 1893, where he is believed to have committed at least 2 murders. He soon coaxed some of the gang members to leave with him and form their own gang, concentrating on the robbery of Wells Fargo shipments. It would be in this endeavor that he saw his greatest success. And we know that Wells Fargo was not happy, and they would send the Pinkertons out, and we all know that story. Anyway. Between 1894 and 1897, Walters robbed an undetermined amount of cash from the shipments, committed several murders in the process. The amounts he is believed to have stolen in legend are in all likelihood exaggerated, as a lot of things in the Old West were. However, the legend goes that Walters began hiding his loot in a secret location around Solomonville, near where he and his gang had their hideout. In July 1898, after a failed robbery attempt in Grants, New Mexico, during which the gang was driven off by heavy gunfire by guards, lawman Jeff Milton, along with lawman George Scarborough, who I'll let you in on the secret, is the guy we're going to talk about, tracked down, then shot and captured Walters and scattered his gang from their hideout, killing another gang member in the process. Walter was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Wells Fargo never recovered the stolen loot, which led to the legend. Walters was released from prison in 1917. Although it's not known for certain, he is believed to have never returned to Solomonville, possibly because there was, in reality, no lost treasure to recover. He settled instead in Hachita, New Mexico, a small ranching community where he worked as a wrangler. And he died on June 16th, 1921, when he fell from a windmill while doing repairs. So, died of basically old age. I guess 52 years old. Basically 52 years old. It's an old age for a Old West outlaw. So another our lawman encountered was a guy named Bert Alvord. Albert Bert Alvord was an American lawman and later outlaw of the Old West. Alvord began his career in law enforcement in 1886 as a deputy under Sheriff John Slaughter in Cochise County, Arizona, but turned to train robbery by the beginning of the 20th century. Apparently, it just paid better. Albert W. Alvord was born to Charles E. Alvord and his wife Lucy on September 11, 1867 in Plumas County, California. His father, a native of New York, worked as a prospector and mechanic for mining companies, but eventually came to hold public office, such as constable and justice of the peace, in several of the places that he and his family lived. The family moved rather frequently throughout Bert's childhood, following the mining business from boomtown to boomtown. In 1879, the family settled in Pima County, Arizona, but soon moved to Tombstone in Cochise County. Alvord's education was informal, but he likely learned much of his father's cases about local disputes. He also spent time working in the actual OK Corral, where he got to know the townspeople very well. Claims that Alvord witnessed the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881 are unsubstantiated, though the banditry and lawlessness for which Tombstone was famous would certainly have made an impression on the young Alvord. Despite Alvord's reputation for frequenting saloons and his participation in several bar altercations, Cochise County Sheriff John Horton Slaughter recruited Alvord as a deputy in 1886. The same year, Alvord's mother died. Alvord served primarily as the muscle behind Slaughter's operations. He made several decisions which revealed his lack of experience and finesse in law enforcement. He was reportedly not noble, temperate, far-seeing, or unselfish. He did assist Slaughter in capturing or killing several rustlers and other outlaws between 1886 and 1889, but his reputation suffered when his alcoholism became increasingly apparent. Alvord continued to frequent saloons and eventually began to associate with gamblers and suspected outlaws. When Slaughter reprimanded him, he quit. He probably liked the outlaws better. Alvord next worked as a lawman in several towns in the 1890s, including Fairbank, Arizona, and Pierce, Arizona. In 1896, Alvord moved to Cochise County, where he married Lola Ochoa, bought a ranch, and settled down. Once again, he became a sheriff's deputy. 2 years later, his father dies. In late December 1899, Alvord suddenly and unexpectedly resigns from his post as deputy sheriff. Almost immediately after turning in his badge, Alvord left his wife and turned to crime. Seems like a good idea, I guess. He formed a gang with outlaws Billy Stiles, Bill Downing, and a guy named Three-Fingered Jack Dunlop. Men he had once pursued during his career as a law officer. Why not? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer, right? Alvord's gang committed several armed robberies in Cochise County where he and Stiles were both captured. Somehow they managed to escape. On February 15, 1900, Dunlop was killed by lawman Jeff Milton during a bungled train robbery in Fairbank, Arizona, and gang recruit Bravo Juan Yaus was wounded. Later that year, Alvord was again captured and taken to Tombstone. Billy Stiles rode into Tombstone and wounded the deputy on duty, allowing Alvord and 24 other prisoners to escape. So he's gotten pretty lucky so far. In 1902, Alvord assisted Arizona Rangers Captain Burton C. Mossman in capturing the notorious Mexican bandit Agustin Chacon in exchange for a share of the reward money and a reduced sentence. When Chacon was convicted of murder and hanged at Solomonville, Alvord decided it was wiser not to surrender after all. Alvord and Stiles instead returned to crime, now pursued by the Arizona Rangers that they had just helped arrest another guy. They were captured in December 1903, but again managed to escape. Alvord even made a crude attempt at faking their deaths, using the bodies of two unknown Mexicans. Alvord sent the bodies to Tombstone, claiming they were, of course, himself and Stiles. However, an examination quickly showed the dead men were not the two gringos. The irritated Arizona Rangers finally pursued the outlaws across the border into Mexico, trapping them near Naco in February 1904. The outlaws resisted but surrendered after having both been wounded. Alvord spent 2 years in the Yuma Territorial Prison. Following his release, he announced his departure by ship to start anew in Central America. He was last seen in 1910 working as a Panama Canal employee. Following this, his fate is absolutely unknown. All right. So there's two that the lawmen we're going to talk about encountered. The last of our outlaws before checking out our lawman is John Selman. John Henry Selman was sometimes identified as an outlaw and sometimes a working lawman of the Old West. What is it with these people? He is best known as the man who fatally shot John Wesley Hardin in the Acme Saloon in El Paso, Texas on August 19, 1895. John Henry Selman was born in Madison County, Arkansas. He was the son of Jeremiah Selman, and the Selman family moved to Grayson County, Texas in 1858. After his father's death on December 16, 1861, Selman joined the 22nd Texas Cavalry and served during the Civil War. On August 17, 1865, Selman married Edna de Graffenried. The couple had 4 children. He and his family eventually moved to Fort Griffin in Shackelford County, Texas, which is just south of us, an hour or so. Been there a few times. In 1877, Selman became a deputy inspector for hides, working under fellow inspector, ex-Shackelford County Sheriff John M. Larn. Selman and Larn fought against rustlers and vigilante justice in the lawless area of northwest Texas. The two were involved in several shootouts with bandits and outlaws during the period that followed. Then, on June 24, 1878, vigilantes shot Larn to death in an Albany, Texas jail cell. Larn had been arrested after 6 hides, which did not belong to him, had been found behind his house. Even though Selman was out of town at the time, he was implicated in the theft and found himself a wanted man, hunted by these same vigilantes who were friends with several men who had previously been either arrested or killed by him. Selman went into hiding during this time, as he was also facing charges stemming from his desertion from the Confederate Army. Selman went to Mexico. However, the end of the war and the resulting dissolution of the Confederacy rendered any prior charges null, and Selman was free to return to the U.S. Selman's wife passed away in 1879 while giving birth to a stillborn child. The other 4 children were placed in the custody of his wife's niece. Selman, by this time, was living in Lincoln County, New Mexico. If any of you guys have ever watched Young Guns, you know where Lincoln County comes from. So this, of course, is during the Lincoln County War. He organized a band called Selman's Scouts, known locally as the Rustlers. The group was accused of numerous acts of rape and murder in the area. However, no charges were ever filed against him in Lincoln County. So Roscoe Rustling Bob Bryant was involved with John Selman's cattle rustling operation. As a member of Selman's Scouts, Bryant was killed by his members near Seven Rivers, New Mexico in September 1878. His body was found near the corpses of Reese Gobley and James Irvin. By 1880, the band had been driven from Lincoln County and began operating in Jeff Davis County, Texas, way out in West Texas. Selman was captured shortly thereafter by Texas Ranger Joe McKittrick and taken to the Shackelford County for trial. Selman escaped and fled again to Chihuahua, Mexico, where he hid out until around 1888 when his name was cleared of all charges against him and were dropped. While in Mexico, he sent for his children. The 2 youngest boys joined their father, but the 2 oldest remained in Brown County, Texas, never to see their father again. He then moved to El Paso, Texas, and on August 23, 1893, he married Remula Grenadine. He began working as a constable, of course, back in law enforcement, and spent time gambling. On April 5, 1894, Selman killed a former Texas Ranger named Bass Outlaw. Outlaw had recently been fired due to his drinking and the threats he made against a judge. Selman encountered an inebriated Outlaw, had suggested that Outlaw needed to go home and sleep it off. When Outlaw declined to go home, however, the 2 instead walked to Tilly Howard's, a local brothel favored by Outlaw. Outlaw created a disturbance at Howard's place, resulting in his fatal shooting of Texas Ranger Joe McKittrick. He also drew on Selman, who was shot and wounded twice in the thigh. Selman returned fire and killed Outlaw. Selman was not arrested for the shooting, which was ruled justified. El Paso policemen and Selman's son, John Jr., arrested the mistress of gunman John Wesley Hardin, Beulah Morose, or Widow Morose, for brandishing a gun in public. Hardin confronted the younger Selman about it, and the two men had a verbal dispute. In accounts supported by members of Selman's family, Hardin pistol-whipped young John Selman and threatened his life. After hearing of the argument, the elder Selman approached Hardin on the afternoon of August 19, 1895. The two exchanged angry words. That night, Hardin went to the Acme Saloon and played dice. Shortly before midnight, Selman walked into the saloon to confront Hardin. Drawing his gun at the door, he walked up behind Hardin. He fired, shooting Hardin in the back of the head, supposedly as Hardin went for his gun, killing him instantly. As Hardin lay on the floor, Selman fired 3 more shots into him. Selman was arrested, charged with the murder, and stood trial. He testified that he realized that Hardin had noticed him enter in the mirror and that Hardin had gone for his gun. Selman swore he fired in self-defense. The hung jury resulted in his release on bond pending retrial. On the night of April 5th, 1896, Selman was killed in a shootout with U.S. Marshal, the lawmen we're going to talk about, George Scarborough. Period newspaper accounts differ as to the exact nature of the bad blood. One account attributes it to an ongoing gambling dispute, while another states that Selman, who was tastefully described as having lived a stormy life, had become an unpredictably violent drunk after the publicity and controversy of killing John Wesley Hardin. It was also widely speculated that Scarborough resented Selman's killing of his old friend Bass Outlaw, given that Outlaw's last act was to kill one of his own fellow marshals and seriously wound Selman in a drunken frenzy at a whorehouse. This seems an unlikely grudge to hold. Instead, especially considering old John's dedication to his son, it's far more likely that Scarborough's testimony, when tried for killing Selman, was truthful. To wit, John Selman Jr., known as Young John, had fallen in love and eloped with a Mexican girl whose father and ambassador disapproved. When they were found, the father had the younger Selman jailed in Juarez. On the night of his death, Selman Sr., who was drinking with Scarborough, said he wanted to talk privately. According to Scarborough, they exited the alley where Selman attempted to enlist him in a conspiracy to cross the border the next morning and stage a jailbreak to free young John. Scarborough expressed sympathy but declined, stating no bad breaks must be made in Juarez, whereupon Selman flew into a rage, exclaiming, "You goddamn son of a bitch, I'm going to kill you." Selman drew first, and Scarborough then shot him in self-defense. Selman died hours later. When it was found that Selman's gun was not at the scene, Scarborough was arrested for murder. Just before his trial, a thief, Cole Belmont, was arrested, and it was then discovered that he had Selman's gun. The thief said he saw the shooting and stole the gun before the crowd arrived. Scarborough was acquitted and released. So there we go. Let's take a look at our lawmen now and the hard link to Texas. Let's talk about this George Scarborough guy. He was a cowboy and lawman who lived during the time of the Wild West. He is best known for having killed outlaw John Selman, who was the killer of John Wesley Hardin we just talked about, and for his partnership with lawman Jeff Milton, with the pair bringing down several outlaws during their time together. Scarborough was born in Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. His family moved to Texas, where for a while he worked as a cowboy. In 1885, he was appointed sheriff for Jones County. He would later work as deputy U.S. Marshal in and around El Paso, Texas. On June 21st, 1895, while working along El Paso Police Chief Jeff Milton, Scarborough shot and killed Martin Morose, a Texas rustler. Morose was buried near John Wesley Hardin and Texas Ranger Ernest St. Leon. Jeff Milton was the chief of police in El Paso at the time, and Scarborough was a U.S. Marshal. Morose had been captured and was killed while being brought back from Mexico by the two lawmen on an outstanding warrant. Outlaw, gunman and paramour of Mrs. Morose, John Wesley Hardin, claimed that he had paid Scarborough and Milton to kill Martin Morose. Milton and Scarborough were arrested, but Hardin later withdrew his comments and the men were released. Scarborough became well known for his unusual tactics when tracking a wanted outlaw. This is where it gets interesting, because we've already talked about some outlaws that turned lawmen that turned outlaws, but this is kind of an outlaw turned lawman. Anyway, often he would drop himself down to the level of those he was pursuing. This tactic was extremely effective and made him a hated and feared man among the outlaw element. There are many accusations that he was actively and ambitiously involved in outlaw gangs which he betrayed, but no one ever conclusively proved that he was involved in unlawful actions. In July 1898, Scarborough and Milton tracked and shot and captured outlaw Bronco Bill Walters, and killing another member of Walters' gang and scattering the rest from a hideout in Solomonville, Arizona. We've already talked about that. In late 1899 and into 1900, Scarborough pursued the Burt Alvord gang, which we talked about. The beginning of the gang's end came during the February 15, 1900 gunfight between 5 of the gang members and Jeff Milton in Fairbank, Arizona, during which gang member Three-Fingered Jack Dunlop was killed and both gang member Bravo Juan Yaus, as well as Jeff Milton, were wounded. Scarborough had long feuded with lawman and outlaw Old John Selman. On April 5, 1894, acting as constable of El Paso, Selman shot and killed Scarborough's close friend and former Texas Ranger Bass Outlaw. Selman was tried for the killing and found not guilty. So there's a bit of a rub. We just talked about John Selman. In reality, Bass Outlaw was not innocent of his own death. Like we talked about, he was intoxicated, he threatened to kill a local judge, and was ordered by Selman to return home, sleep off his intoxication. Outlaw instead visited a brothel, then a saloon. He argued with Texas Ranger Joe McKittrick, who attempted to talk him into leaving. Outlaw shot and killed Ranger McKittrick, then turned on Selman, who engaged him in a gunfight. Selman was wounded twice in the thigh. Outlaw was killed, and the killing was found justified by the court. On August 19, 1895, John Selman murdered John Wesley Hardin at the Acme Saloon Bar in El Paso. In 1896, on the second anniversary of his friend Outlaw's death, Scarborough supposedly called Selman into an alley behind the Wigwam Saloon where the two men argued and fought. Scarborough claimed both drew their guns, so he fatally shot Selman. However, no gun was found on Selman's body. And then the story about the thief and had the gun and all that stuff. So Scarborough was acquitted again. And at this point, he decides to leave Texas. He moves to Deming, New Mexico, where he worked as a gunman for the Grant County Cattlemen's Association. He was also associated with the arrest of a guy named Pearl Hart. On April 1st, 1900, Scarborough was involved in a shootout with another outlaw, George Stevenson and James Brooks. He killed one of the men but was shot in the leg and was taken back to Deming, where the leg was amputated, and then he died 4 days later, coincidentally, 6 years to the day after the death of his friend, Texas Ranger Bass Outlaw, and 4 years to the day after he shot Outlaw's killer, John Selman. An alternate story claims that on April 5, 1900, Scarborough and Walter Birchfield were tracking Harvey Logan, a.k.a. Kid Curry, near San Simon, Arizona, and trapped him near the Triangle Canyon. A gunfight ensued in which Scarborough was mortally wounded by Curry. That's just legend. Yeah. So, lawmen turned outlaws. and a lawman that was maybe more outlaw than anything else, but he was justified in his killings. Kind of sounds like the TV show Justified with Deputy U.S. Marshal Raylan Givens. Just kind of, it sounds like the lawmen weren't too law-worthy, and it sounds like a lot of the outlaws were bad dudes, but then they got into law enforcement sometime afterwards. I don't know. The West, the Old West, the Wild West, what a crazy time, right? So there you go. I mean, we talked a bit about people living in Fort Griffin and El Paso, of course, Arizona, all over the place. I don't know. What do y'all think? Let me know what other weird, off-the-wall, or interesting Texas history you'd like to hear about. I want to thank our sponsors again. That's me and Victory Home Loans. If you know someone moving to or in Texas or Oklahoma, send them my way to themichaelmitchell.com, T-H-E, michaelmitchell.com. Remember, I sell dreams, not mortgages. Thank you all for tuning into Once Upon a Time in Texas. As always, remember, the stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas. Y'all have a great week.